My name is Robert Reid-Pharr, and we're here to have a wonderful discussion. Thank you. We're here to have a wonderful discussion about James Baldwin's essays. Like any good panel of New Yorkers, we were already having a fight about how we were going to begin the thing.
Not a fight, a discussion.
And so we wanted to talk about why we're here and also what first brought us to James Baldwin. And I wanted to say I'm a university professor and I'm writing a biography of James Baldwin. And part of the reason that I'm here is that I wanted to impress upon people and want to impress upon people that James Baldwin's genius was not something that was just innate or inborn, but that in fact he was a person who worked very, very hard at his craft over many, many years. And that I think when we talk about his writing, we talk about it as if it's magic. But the truth of the matter is that, like the people next to me, he's a person who put an enormous amount of effort into it, an effort that was not seen. The other thing I wanted to say while I'm here is that I am sitting next to some of the greatest writers in the English language right now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Lord of mercy.
Yes, sir.
Right? They're all shy and sweet and won't say it, but I will. I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you all for coming. I've always heard about this. I didn't realize it was so spectacular, and I feel bad that I have my back to some folks. So
hey, back row.
we're thinking about in the side. Thank you, James Baldwin, and the essay. Actually, on the way here, I was reading "Take Me to the Water," and it's just what young people these days will call like the braided essay. I feel like his essays are so braided, and this one, that Take Me to the Water, starts with him describing his mother holding a piece of velvet while saying, "That's a good idea." And he says he was 5 listening to this and realizes that, is the good idea velvet? And I thought that was such a beautiful, gorgeous way to begin an essay, and that's so emblematic of so many of the essays. And through my train ride, I was rereading it. We get to Algeria, to Camus, and just back to velvet, back to mother, back to the church, and there's just so much in all these essays. That's one of the reasons that I'm here, and I so want to hear and learn from both of you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very nervous. So I can't separate reading James Baldwin from coming of age. The first thing I read by James Baldwin was not an essay, but a novel. On a holiday trip, I was reading Giovanni's Room in the back seat of the car, and I didn't know why I was reading it, but the rest of my family knew. And they were very, very quiet. And my mother would look behind at me to see, well, he is reading. And Dell paperbacks back then were kind of like dirty books almost. So I stayed away from James Baldwin after that until a high school teacher handed me a copy of the New York Review of Books with an open letter to my sister, Miss Angela Davis. And it rather took off the top of my head. And in those days, if you were a sort of black kid who couldn't dribble a basketball and had other problems, something like this was a real door or a liberation, that it was okay to be interested in books, that it was okay not to be, I don't know what else, not to be yourself yet, or something like that. And then I remember on campus stopping, I had to stop and read Notes of a Native Son, that essay. I actually had to stop and read it where I was. It had such a physical effect on me. And it's with me every time I sit down to write, my memory of thinking, this is a possibility. And the thing that was so dramatic about James Baldwin in our lives is that nobody had to make excuses for him, or apologies, or explain him. He was brilliant from the very beginning. And he's the kind of writer you fall in love with when you're young. And the personality that comes out of the page, you kind of don't get over this first love. He had unreal gifts as a prose stylist, and it's exactly what Professor Reid-Pharr said. I remember Mary McCarthy was totally surprised to find that Baldwin had read so much, which was shifty on her part, but never mind. And he never refers to any of his reading really in his writing. He doesn't sort of show off in any way. There are no poetry quotations, no citations, nothing academic. If anything, it's the Bible or the blues. So I think why we come to Baldwin again and again and again is his voice. You know, he did work very hard, but he had this unreal gift to begin with, and that's his voice.
If I may, since we're going to do our the first time I encountered James Baldwin stories, in 1978 or 1979, I was in the ninth grade, and I'm from North Carolina, and I was in the Tar Heel Junior Historians. The North Carolinians are known as Tar Heels, and I was a nerd, so I was in the Junior Historians. And so we did a field trip to Meredith College. Now, Meredith College was an all-women's college. It was formerly segregated, but it was the first college campus I had been on. And so all the other Tar Heel Junior Historians were there from around the state. And one group came in rebel, gray and red. And so I was like, I got to get out of here. So I went to the first ever college bookstore that I went to. And there I encountered the first book I'd ever seen with a picture of a black person on the cover. I know. And so it was Go Tell It on the Mountain. And I thought, thank the Lord Jesus that's the first thing I found. And I read it, and it was about what we would now think of as a queer kid coming of age, who was also a Pentecostal, and it was a 14-year-old. And so I was also a Pentecostal and also 14. And it was the first time that I realized that I was reading everything I could get my hands on, but it really was the first time that I'd ever realized that something could be written about, that literature could be written about people like me. And if I can switch up a little bit, I want to say, in terms of James Baldwin's essay writing, I know that right around that time of his life, when he was a junior high school student, he was receiving some of the best instruction in terms of prose writing then available in the city of New York. So I don't know if people know this, but James Baldwin was a student at DeWitt Clinton. DeWitt Clinton was a particularly gifted high school at that moment. One of the things that I think we forget is that the Harlem Renaissance writer Countee Cullen was James Baldwin's junior high school French teacher. And also James Baldwin was trained by Abel Meeropol. Now, Abel Meeropol was known professionally as Lewis Allen. Lewis Allen wrote Strange Fruit, the lyric for Strange Fruit. I have a note from Abel Meeropol to James Baldwin. If you're nice, I might read it. But a lot of what is true about James Baldwin is that we think of Black genius, or genius period, as something that is, in fact, something that's innate to the human being. But I think that the message I want to leave with this crowd, that if you want to have more genius, do better instruction with our young people, and put your hands on them and teach them and teach them the wholeness of the tradition into which they've been born, a progressive tradition. If you want to talk about what James Baldwin has done,
and also open doors like this, because this place was my library. I went to Clara Barton High School and would walk over after school, and this is where I might copy the first. I was 14 and Pentecostal too.
Here we are.
And Caribbean Pentecostal is a little extra.
Yes, it is.
And so I first Baldwin was Go Tell on the Mountain, and I was literally reading the church scenes in church, because they felt so real, so vibrant to me. and this idea that a young person was trying to figure out their way to that. And when you're in the church, there was this idea that like where it was like backslide, like that was always the danger. And to see how he was managing that in the book with the friendships and the neighborhood and the family structure, for me that was powerful. And in that summer, I came through here and I read as much as I could read of Baldwin, as much as was available here. But that was my first exposure, and there were scenes in it that felt like a little bit of implanted essays. There's that scene where he goes and looks at the city, and thinks of himself and you were saying that with all the biblical references, like the underlying biblical, and you always felt like sort of the Bible stories. You always felt the preacher Baldwin in the novels. Like I certainly feel them in the essay, because like there's always like kind of like, let's bring it home now, like, right. And the novel felt like that to me, and I'd seen that scene so much of like where you overcome and just like go to the altar. That scene of like the altar call. I'd never seen that in literature before.
Right. Edwidge, you grew up right here in Brooklyn?
Yes.
Because there's some bad talk going around town that you've been living in one of the lesser boroughs.
Miami?
Oh!
Good one.
Touche.
Well, I'm living in one of the other boroughs right now, but I grew up here. Yes, this was actually my library, and I always, back then when you would come here, there was a limit. You could have 10 items, and I was always trying to push for 12 or 14. Yeah.
I do think access to education must be democratic, but the mystery of talent never will be. I came from a family of readers who were suspicious of Baldwin to begin with, because my father's hero was Richard Wright, but he had died. And so when Baldwin started publishing his books, not the essays that only a few people saw, when he started publishing his books, there hadn't been anything like that. Nobody had ever sounded like that. There had been a lot of sociology and history of a very distinguished kind, but there hadn't been the personal essay in this American tradition of Thoreau and Emerson for the Black experience, apart from the Black autobiographies that didn't seem to travel to the next generation. So when his books started coming out in 61 and The Fire Next Time in 63, think of how ahead of Malcolm X and Claude Brown he was. There was just this guy. And I make a mistake, or I realize in all the years I've been writing about Baldwin, I insist on a division between the early essays and the late essays. The early essays of patience and integration, and the late essays of disappointment and militant sort of rage. And I'm wrong about that completely. I looked at Notes of a Native Son and Personal History this morning. I was stunned by how aggressive his language is and how fearsome his message is from the very beginning. So why is it that I go back in my head and kind of make a nice Baldwin, that we can relate to, and then this angry Baldwin that Raoul picked up right away? So he's also a writer that every time you go back to him, there's something else, something new. The sort of depth of what he could do is, well, the mark of his dedication and gifts as a writer, I think, because there's so much in it. The way he talks to begin with.
Darryl, if I can piggyback on that a little bit. The split between Richard Wright and James Baldwin really has to do with the publication of James Baldwin's essay, Everybody's Protest Novel. Now, the interesting thing about that is that essay, we imagine James Baldwin published in, I forget when, in the 1950s, but he had actually come up with the idea of the protest novel, writing for a leftist journal in the 40s as, I think, a 19-year-old. And he'd been kicking that idea around for a while. And so the idea got better and better as he developed, or more and more advanced, I'll say, as he developed. But the journal that he published in was a specifically sort of left-leaning and Marxist-tinged journal. And I think that American people forget that certainly in the time that Baldwin was in high school and the time that he was a teen, a lot of the personnel in his high school, certainly, were in fact people who were effectively Reds, left Marxist people who were in fact escaping anti-communism in this country, and many of whom actually found themselves in the New York City public school system. Plus, a lot of the journals that he first worked for were in fact left Marxist journals as well. And so that part of what he's trying to do in those, the concept of Everybody's Protest novel was something that he was doing when he was doing book reviews for $5 a pop. And that part of what he was trying to do was to make up his mind about what the trajectory of American literature should be, and also as a very, very young man trying to figure out how he could fit himself into that. And it's something that began for him as a teen. He was young when he published Everybody's Protest novel, but if you look at the Baldwin Archive, one of the things that he did over and over and over again with his essays is that there are a billion versions of it. If you just go to look at the Baldwin Archive at the Schomburg Center or the big Baldwin Archive at Beinecke, that there's a lot of paper. And so it wasn't just that, oh my gosh, he had a grand idea. It was that sometimes he was working on those ideas across much time. To wit, speaking not even so much about the archives, but the basic storyline for his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, he published in the Magpie, which was the student magazine at DeWitt Clinton High School. So all of those characters are actually represented in a story that's written by, I don't know, a 16, 17-year-old. And I think I'm sure there are a bunch of writers and creative people in this room. And it's one of the things I'm sure that you guys do when we rifle through your papers, that one of the things I'm sure we'll find is that the 14-year-old versions of you, the 16-year-old versions of you, the 26-year-old versions of you, they're fibbing, actually have a lot of stuff that you've been working on over time. I'm sure that the mature writers that we're looking at are working on ideas that percolate over time. And I think that we do a disservice to James Baldwin when we only imagine him as a person who works from inspiration. And also, it's a little bit of a myth that he tells about himself sometimes, that he's not as unbelievably considered with his writing, particularly the essays, as one might imagine.
I mean, there was a great show at the Schomburg, Jimmy God's Black Revolutionary Mouth, I think it was called. And they had so many editions of the Magpie, and we've been reading in class the Nothing Personal, that essay that was published alongside photographs by Richard Avedon, and it turned out that they were at the same high school, and that essay was such a gorgeous and beautiful essay. But it was interesting to see in that archive, like the poems that he had written, and just like the evolution of James Baldwin, like young James Baldwin, and just all the concerns, you're right, were absolutely there, like in different lines of the poems, that leading to even to that collaboration, but to other essays.
He was also in high school with Saul Stein. If you guys know who Saul Stein was an important editor who I think was an editor at the Boston-based lefty press. I was going to say Beacon. Don't be mean to me if I've gotten it wrong. But I think that's where Baldwin first published Notes of a Native Son as well. So this high school friend of his is the person who allowed that unbelievably important work to be published, and was the person who told James Baldwin that he should in fact collect the essays that he had done over time. These are people who had known each other since they were 14, 15.
I just have so much on my mind, if you don't mind if I'm incoherent for a while. When Baldwin was starting out, figures like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison were having a lot of trouble with their radical past. A lot of black writers did. And then not only that, the Harlem Renaissance had completely sort of gone. County Cullen may have been his French teacher, but Baldwin never referred really to the Harlem Renaissance writers as anyone who had an influence on him. Richard Wright was that political generation that looked down on the Jazz Age as too committed to entertaining white people, and they were going to be serious. Every generation of black writers was going to not make the mistake of the previous generation. So for Baldwin's time, the emphasis was on Freud, not Marx. So he had this kind of psychoanalysis that hadn't been done in sort of black life before. And so he kind of did it on himself. The funny thing about Baldwin is that as intimate as his voice is, he tells us very little about himself in his essays. You know, it's only kind of a seduction, and you trust him, and it's true, but he doesn't tell you very much. And in a funny way, his essays were for one thing, and the novels were for something else. If I might put it crudely, the essays were about race and politics, and the novels were about sex and love, because he needed something where he could break the rules a bit more in order to say what he had to say. And he did that in both forms, but in the novel, because it was such a, potentially damaging thing that he was doing. But I think also we can't forget his bravery as a writer and how hard it was to say things. Look how hard it is to say things now. So think back decades, and you had very few people on your side to help you say it other than some editors who believed in you and friends who sort of knew you couldn't do anything else, and his mother. So, yeah.
And not just to say things, but to act, right? To get on the bus, to get other writers together, to actually take action and to believe that you can change the course of things.
The witness.
Yes.
I'll say that that about following up on your comments about County Cullen, it's County Cullen who first gave James Baldwin the idea to move to France.
Was County Cullen?
County Cullen was James Baldwin's junior high school
I knew
French
that,
teacher.
but I always thought it was right.
County Cullen had been on a Guggenheim to France. And so he had told James Baldwin about having gone to France and it having been a liberating experience for him when James Baldwin was a child. Wright then goes to France while James Baldwin and Richard Wright Richard Wright wrote a letter of recommendation for James Baldwin that got him a fellowship that allowed him to do a lot of work. They were quite close. Richard Wright goes to France and James Baldwin follows, but it's County Cullen who first tells him that France is a good idea.
Wrong about something else?
But you're right
So
about so
wrong.
much. You're right about so much. You're right about so much.
I've said this in so many essays. Sometimes you have
We're all
to
learning.
shut the F up.
No,
Thank you.
not you. And please stop calling me professor. I'm just plain old Robert, unless you're in one of my classes.
Hardly ever.
I want to ask you both how, because that's something I'm working through too, like how the essays change when Baldwin goes abroad, like Stranger in the Village, and like how.
Well, he, in the Istanbul film, he says that, your own country, sometimes you see more clearly at a distance from another country. I never thought he meant it that way. I always thought another country was, another kind of way of being or something like that. But he really meant this physical distance, and he could reflect, and he sort of needed that. It's a bit like what, never mind.
That's a hard question, and it's a hard question.
That's why I asked it.
But look, it's not simply that James Baldwin spent so much time in France, but he spent, the unbelievable collection of photographs from Sedat Pakay are in this building now. James Baldwin spent an enormous amount of time in Turkey and was very much connected to Turkish intellectuals. And he also spent a lot of time on the, there's a lot of time that he spent, or an important time that he spent on the island of Corsica. And a lot of traveling that he did. He was a person who wrote everywhere. So I think, it's funny, I'm not sure that James Baldwin ever really came back to New York in the way that we are now New Yorkers. I think that he owned a house, and I think that he bought and his mother lived in it. I count that as Mrs. Baldwin's house. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that James Baldwin came as a personage to that house, or as a son to that house. But I think that he bought the property, but it was not his home per se. I think the home for him that seems most like a home was the one in Saint Paul de Vence. And that place. Oh, you think not?
Well, his personal life was always a mess. So he never bought that house.
Are you trying to get back at me for the thing about from the France thing? I'm sorry.
No, there's no getting
I'm
back.
sorry.
I forgot now what I was going to say.
I think that one of the things we know about that house is that everybody was all up in it.
Yes.
So there were
home.
People who lived there more than James Baldwin did, most certainly, and there are very, very famous people who visited there, and people that you've never heard of who visited there and stayed for good long whiles. And I know that his room in it was the least attractive place in the house. You know, so he would go down to what he called the dungeon to do his late night. But he was certainly a person who was able to write in multiple locations. So
Yes, because he was starting and stopping and starting over. I had no idea he wrote The Fire Next Time in Istanbul. So I think that the difference I thought between their early essays and the late essays of something more patient and hopeful and something bitter and disappointed actually has to do with something else, which is density of thought and language. And the essays he wrote abroad at first, he's thrown back on his own language, thrown back on his own experience. He doesn't know French well enough yet. He certainly never learned Turkish. So the English is all in his head. You know, this is his sort of world. And you look at the early essays and the density of the language and the clauses and the rhythm, they sort of say a lot about writing them over and over and over and over again. And I can't decide if he was the kind of writer who didn't know what he thought until he wrote it down, or if he could walk around and think about it, and so that when he finally wrote, it was the last thing. I sort of think he probably had to find as he wrote, because it's odd that his essays remind me most of Virginia Woolf's essays, that you're immediately in the moment of how they're thinking, what they're thinking, and part of the excitement of the writing is that you are getting to this conclusion with them as they're making it.
right. If I can say a writerly thing about it, I think that I know that the first 2 years that James Baldwin lived in France, the first time that he went, he did not speak French. And he writes about how that gave him the ability to just be silent and to not hear what other people were saying. And that his French never gets perfect. And I know this because I was in Paris taking a French class, and my French teacher showed me a tape of James Baldwin being interviewed in France. And he said, "Look, his French is almost as bad as yours," literally. Literally, and my French is bad, you know. And so my sense is that I understand that as a writer, the need to actually just have, 5 minutes. The need.
Already?
I know. I'm sorry about the bad French. We don't get any more time. That I think that as a writing person, one understands the need to just not hear all of the chatter and the sort of "this is what you must think" that is sort of forced on you. And my guess is that James Baldwin used Paris for that as well, not simply just a location of liberation, but a place where it was efficacious to not hear what people were saying on the street.
I mean, I think it was also interesting to see, you see in this, but the Take Me to the Water, because it's so fresh in my mind, this acknowledgement of his Americanness in those settings, where he's saying this passport, that I'm carrying grants me so much access because, the Arabs were being so badly treated in France. He was exempt from that because in a way it's like this passport gives me access, but in America it would just mean like I can still be killed here and it wouldn't matter like in America. So he was, I think, with the gradual better understanding of the language, also was trying to understand these situations, even in that village, in A Stranger in the Village, where he was called, it's like a sale nègre, like he was suspected of stealing wood and things like that, but that he wrote in the text even like they call me a sale nègre. So that it was you see like, and we travel, you're right, with the essays, like we see kind of these. I think he was one of those people that, at least in the first draft, wrote to figure out what he was thinking, because even in the finished essays we feel like we're on this journey and we land someplace with him, but we've traveled through that process.
Since the mean man says that we have to end soon, I just want to change the topic and say, this crowd of people is going through a very difficult time in our period. What's your wisdom you want to tell them?
Don't give up. Don't give up. Hang in there, and let's let's do it all together.
I think we know about George Floyd because people stayed in the streets, so keep that in mind. Did you know Florence Kennedy? Florence Kennedy? Okay.
I think we're done, and I'll say that I believe that I'll say that being in this room with all of you makes me realize that this is all the hope that we need, and we have everything that we need right in our hands. So be good to each other.
Thank you.